Hello, and welcome to Our Stories and Ourselves, a podcast about how our minds make stories and stories make us. My name is Kirsty, and in this show, I talk about the stories we tell ourselves about the world, the stories we tell ourselves about history, and about how the way we think shapes these stories and shapes us. Today, I'm going to talk about the stories we hear if we take Psych 101, or if we read some of the pop psych articles around why people are the way they are. Some people might not be happy with me calling them stories, as I'm talking about scientific studies, but as I've tried to get across in the first couple of episodes, stories are the way we join facts together, and often there is more than one narrative that can fit a set of facts, especially if you are picky about which facts you include. Before I go any further, a content warning. I do speak a bit about the Holocaust and abuse of prisoners in Abu Ghraib in Iraq. I don't go into any great detail, but I wanted to give you a heads up that that's in this episode. So, there are several famous psychological studies which make it into every Psych 101 syllabus, and which have also made it into the wider understanding of human psychology, at least across the English-speaking parts of the world. First up, the Milgram experiment. For anyone unfamiliar, the experiment involved participants who were told they were part of a study of learning. When they arrived, they were told that they were assigned to the role of a teacher. In this role, they had to administer electric shocks to someone in another room when the learner made an error. The voltage started off low, but got higher as the person in the other room made more and more mistakes. The teacher participant soon started to hear the learner cry out in pain. However, it wasn't actually a study of learning. The real goal was to understand how the participants reacted to authority. Did they follow instructions, even when it sounded like they were hurting someone? How far would they go? The answer is mixed. Yes, mixed, which may surprise some listeners who have heard parts of this before. The top-line finding, which is most familiar, is that a lot of people complied. 65% in one version of the study. However, that is not the whole story. If 65% complied, that means 35% didn't. And, to be honest, I find them a whole lot more interesting. The percentage of people who complied with the instructions from authority figures in the Milgram studies varied, depending on the setting. There were fewer people willing to continue to deliver electric shocks to the learners when it was run outside of the university, and when the experimenters weren't wearing lab coats. There were also versions where the alleged learner was in the room. When people could see the apparent harm of their actions, they were much less likely to comply. Particularly interesting to me was that lots of participants would continue when giving a reason, when prompted that it was part of the experiment. You know, do it for science, if you will. People kept going. Whereas if they were given an order, they tended to stop. Psychology researchers Haslam and Riker, who have re-examined the Milgram research archives, suggest the findings are more in line with convincing people to do things rather than people just obeying orders. True, this does mean that people can be convinced into atrocities, but that is different. Still a problem, but a different problem. This is only the beginning of the complexity. Recent reviews of tapes of the experiments indicate that there was a great deal more coercion and bullying of the participants than was detailed in the write-ups. If people resisted, they faced a lot of pressure to continue. Recordings of the experiments show participants were reluctant and uncomfortable. It wasn't just automatic compliance with an instruction. Still not great, but this is a difference. Even more so when you think about the 35% or more, depending on the version, who did resist, despite the coercion. In addition to this, some participants worked out the experiment was fake and may have just been playing along. If there's no actual risk, might as well keep pressing the buttons, right? All in all, the experiment was more complex than some Psych 101 texts would have you believe. Yes, a scarily high number of people went along with it. However, a lot of people resisted, depending on how convincing the explanation from the experimenter was, or how coercive they were, where the experiment was held, and what the participant could see. There's more than one story here. Under the narrative that most people comply is a host of reasons why they do, and times when they don't. There have also been bigger picture criticisms of the Milgram studies. They point out that the studies ignore the political, ideological, and policy context of the time. A paper by Russell and Gregory points out that there was a lot of implicit ideology and policy in the Milgram study, which wasn't really examined in the write-ups. There was the idea that experiments must be done in a certain way, the encouragement of participants to continue, even the technology that separated the teacher from the learner. These all contributed to the actions of the participants and the stories that they told themselves about why they were doing it. Russell and Gregory also point out that Milgram had to convince other experimenters to keep going, and he talked them into it even when they were clearly distressed participants. He did this by convincing the other experimenters of the importance of understanding obedience. This reminds me of how the participants were also persuaded to keep going. For science. There's a lot of ideology at play here, which wasn't fully explored. They also mention the wider societal pressures of the time, including the prestige of academics, who were, often listened to because they were thought to be important and trustworthy, and the risks of non-conformity in the McCarthy era, where being too socialist appearing could get you into all sorts of trouble. I'm going to dig into that a little bit more in a bit, but first I want to talk about another couple of experiments. Firstly, the Asch group conformity experiments. It's another famous study, albeit one with much lower stakes. In this research, participants were asked which lines, drawn on a piece of paper, matched, while others in the room were plants who deliberately gave the wrong answer. People would often conform to the group answer, even when it was blatantly incorrect. Again, this has been used to support the narrative that people usually go along with the group, even when they are wrong. However, say it with me now, it was more complicated than that. Participants didn't always conform. If there was one dissenter, or if the participant didn't really respect the other members of the group, then they were more likely to be accurate. To me, the finding about the dissenter shows the importance of speaking up. You're probably not the only one in the room who disagrees, even if no one else is saying it, and saying something can encourage others around you. The Asch experiments have been replicated many times in many different settings, and the findings vary. Studies in the 70s found much less conformity than those in the 50s, and the authors of the 70s study suggest that the social climate supported more dissent by that point. This fits with the idea that understanding the social context is important for the Milgram experiments too, and that the social context is part of the stories which guide people's actions. However, the Asch experiments were also very low stakes. Who really cares about how long a line is? There's not really any consequences to being wrong. There were some variations that put in some mild consequences and incentives, but let's look at an experiment with somewhat higher stakes. The Stanford prison experiment. In this study, participants signed up to a study of prison experiences. They were assigned to a role as either a prisoner or a guard. As the experiment progressed, those who were assigned to be guards became more brutal, and those assigned to be prisoners became more passive. This has led to a story that people, ordinary people off the street, will fall into a role they are assigned and behave consistently with it. Some psychology texts reported that all the guards became abusive. The story is that people followed assigned roles, submit to authority, and do what they're told. However, once again, it's more complex than that. There are many criticisms of the study. To start with, the guards weren't told they were study subjects. They thought they were helping the experimenters. The guards were given some rules rather than just making them all up, and they were trained. Their behaviour didn't arise spontaneously just because they were told they were prison guards. This puts their behaviour in a study of prisons into somewhat of a different light, especially as the guard participants were given some instructions on how to treat prisoners. This contradicts the narrative which came out of the study, reporting that the way the guards were behaving was a natural consequence of the situation they were in, being told they were a guard and given a uniform. They saw following the instructions as part of the study and that they had to be arsehole guards to make the study work. Even in this circumstance, the guards behaved in role at some times, but at others they didn't. They were kinder, sometimes pushed back against the instructions they were given. There was also a great deal of variation within the guard group, and some didn't lead in to the guard role at all. Similar to the Milgram study, there was a lot more rebellion and variation in the study participants than is mentioned in the headline findings. Researchers have also looked at the archives from the Stanford prison experiment, and again have drawn out some of the complexities that don't fit the headline story. La Teixeira, who examined the experiment archives, also found that the guards saw themselves as more research assistants than participants. Indeed, at least one, uncomfortable with his role, said that he kept it up for the sake of the research. In addition, all participants were at least partly motivated by the money they were getting, and the prisoners were led to believe that they couldn't just leave at any time. This isn't consistent with reporting that the prisoners, too, fell into the role they were assigned and became passive. Examination of the archives show that the participants didn't just assume the guard role when assigned it. They were told they would need to act as guards to make the experiment work. They not only knew it was an experiment, but were persuaded for the sake of science that they needed to fulfill their role and make the participant prisoners' experience uncomfortable. Another thing worth noting is that Zimbardo wanted to show the toxicity of prisons from the start. This, in and of itself, is not a bad thing. All experiments start off with a hypothesis. However, I think that the way he thought about it may have biased his approach. Rather than design an experiment to test how people reacted when assigned to the guard role, he designed one to show how badly people behaved. In that, he did succeed, but it distorted our understanding of and our stories about prison guards for years to come. Back to that in a bit. But first, there is one big difference between Milgram and Zimbardo's studies. While Milgram did many follow-ups and identified circumstances where people were less compliant, this didn't happen with Zimbardo's prison experiment. The extreme findings from the original study reduced the number of follow-ups on ethical grounds. Understandable, but it's also not really scientifically rigorous to base findings and generalisations on one study. Don't have a simple answer to that, but it's worth noting. Challenges to the research have been limited by the reluctance to replicate it. A dilly of a pickle, as one of my old teachers would say. However, it's not impossible to replicate, or at least to run similar experiments. There was a similar study in which participant guards were specifically trained to treat participant prisoners as individuals. Earth-shattering, I know. And they were treated better. That won't solve all problems with prisons, but it's worth noting. Give people a different story about the details of their role, and they behave differently. As well as this, the BBC, of all places, ran a replication study of the Stanford prison experiment. Well, that's not quite the full story, although it's called the BBC Prison Study. The study was designed and run by academics. The BBC prepared the study environment, filmed it, and broadcast some of the resulting footage. It wasn't reality TV, but it wasn't far off either. It also wasn't a full replication, but rather a study of inequality and power dynamics in a simulated institutional setting. They knew enough about their limits to emphasise it wasn't really a prison. There were very intensive ethical boundaries set up around the study, including independent clinical psychologists monitoring it, who could pull the plug at any time. This study had quite different findings to the Stanford experiment. At first, those in the guard positions in this study were unwilling to fulfill their roles. A fairly egalitarian system was developed, but it was unstable. Things did eventually turn towards tyranny, But the process was a lot more convoluted. There were people, both assigned to being prisoners and guards, who were more authoritarian, and they wanted to change the system. It was in a deadlock when the experimenters brought the trial to an end. The findings still highlight the impact of roles, but also that there has to be group support for actions for them to be effective, whether that is a guard being brutal, a prisoner rebelling, or the maintenance of the communal system. I also found it interesting that while strong personalities were a factor in how the study played out, it also took group consensus. Even the strongest personalities couldn't impose their will if enough others disagreed. A particular fun snippet is that a 10th prisoner participant was introduced after the start of the study. The man had a trade union background and promptly suggested that rather than just the prisoners challenge the guards, all the participants should get together and challenge the experimenters. Solidarity in action against the true authority figures. Some of the experimenters from the BBC prison study wrote a paper which was one of the key sources for this episode. It's called Contesting the Nature of Conformity, what Milgram and Zimbardo's studies really show. Authors Alexander Haslam and Stephen Reicher point out that the participants in both the Milgram and Zimbardo experiments were fed a narrative about what they were doing, which helped convince them to act in a certain way. Their argument is that the social context and the convincing of the participants to do it for science had more weight than came across in the reports of the studies at the time. There's also a subtext I see here. The initial reporting of these studies, and the narratives usually told about them, are of people being compliant, authoritarian when assigned that role, and generally willing to hurt and exploit other people. These findings, and the way they were reported, fed into narratives around the way people react to authority, which still hold sway today. It's a scary but fairly convincing story. Most people do what they're told on some level, especially when an authority figure is doing the telling. This story, in turn, explains some atrocious human behaviour. People comply with the group, fall into assigned roles, and obey authority. While scary, it's also weirdly comforting. Most people aren't inherently evil, they just follow orders. However, as I've talked about, each of these studies actually show that people react in a variety of ways, and there are all sorts of things, from training to others speaking up, that change how people behave. So what happened? Where did this narrative of people complying with authority and with roles they are assigned come from? Part of it is the context of the experiments. These studies are often discussed in the context of trying to understand how the atrocities of World War II happened. This is especially the case after the trial of Adolf Eichmann had taken place in 1961 and had been recorded, and various clips had been televised. It brought the full horror of the Holocaust into the living rooms of people across the world. The story of his defence, that he was just following orders, drove people in a specific direction when it came to trying to understand his actions and those of other Holocaust perpetrators. This turned out not to be true. Evidence later emerged that Eichmann actually was pretty anti-Semitic and did a lot of the things he did during the Holocaust because he planned them and pretty much wanted to do them. The real-life evidence also fits with this wider narrative that there's a bit more to it than just following orders. The narratives also focused on those who did comply because of the questions they were asking. I get it. I've done similar things. Focus on what I want to know and whether my hypothesis is supported, and not look so much at the bigger picture. But I think there is a danger in this narrative, especially if people buy into it too much. It's important to know why people follow orders and do atrocious things, but at the same time, if we go shrug, well, people do what they're told by authority. People comply. Guess there's no point in resisting. Then I think there's a risk that this can lead to people giving themselves a pass, complying in advance with an order they think is coming, because they see compliance as inevitable. But people do resist, in the experiments and in reality. People resisted the experimenters in Milgram. People pushed back in the Stanford experiment, and much more so in other similar experiments. As I said, the union organiser in the BBC study even tried to get the prisoner and guard participants allied against the experimenters. To me, that's also an important, possibly even a more important story. Another interesting point the researchers make in the BBC study is that the guards openly discussed how they would be perceived in the TV show. It suggests to me that scrutiny and accountability can make a difference, at least if there's a perception that violent behaviour will be judged. So yes, we want to understand obedience and what makes supposedly normal people do terrible things, but I also want to understand those who resist and those normal people who do extraordinary things. There are lots of stories of atrocities from the Holocaust, but there are also lots of stories of kindness and generosity. I think most people are familiar with Schindler's List and some of the other famous narratives, but there are many, many other stories of people who helped those persecuted by the Nazis. Whether it was sheltering one family, or the Swedish diplomat who issued hundreds of passports for Jewish people in Hungary so they were protected and could eventually flee. There's a story that did the rounds on social media. I think it was a few years ago. I haven't been able to find it again, or source it, but it fits with a lot of Holocaust stories that are evidenced, so I'm going to tell it. The story goes that there was a woman smuggling a Jewish child to safety. They were on a bus when someone got on, recognised them, and denounced them to the driver. Whether this was a compliant citizen just following the rules, or someone driven by anti-Semitism and the social context that made this sort of behaviour okay, we'll never know. My guess is it was probably both. The driver, as a municipal employee, had a duty to hand them over. He stopped the bus and ordered everyone off. I expect the rat walked off pleased they had done their duty. As an aside, it's interesting that they made it the bus driver's problem. They didn't have to deal directly with handing the woman and child over. The driver shut the door with the woman and child still on board. They were terrified, thinking they were going to be handed over to the Nazis. But the driver didn't do that. He asked them where they needed to go and got them as close as he could, risking his own safety and employment in the process. Yes, we need to know what brings people to sell out a fellow human being, but I also want to understand what makes people like the bus driver and how we can have more of them. If you do know more about this story, please do let me know. I'm always keen to have all the context. Now, it's been a while since I took Psych 101. I dug out my old textbooks, which I still have because I'm that nerd. It was published in 2003. Milgram was in my Psych 101 book, reported much as I described earlier. Didn't come across the Stanford experiment till second year, in 2005. The BBC study wasn't published until 2006. Maybe it's made its way into the syllabus since. However, as of the 2019 research paper by Le Teixeira, most intro to psych texts still don't cover much of the criticisms and nuance of these studies, other than the ethics of the approach. In 2025, maybe these studies are taught better. If you know, please do tell me. However, they've been taught for so long that a lot of people are familiar with them and the things that they suggest about people and how we interact with the world. There are also studies of altruism out there, and I'll probably make that a future episode. Otherwise, I'd risk falling into the same trap I'm talking about. But I think there's also a story in here about the way we think about facts and about science. Science is a journey. We're always learning new things that change how we understand the world. Part of being a scientist is always being willing to have your own theories tested and adapting them as new evidence emerges. I think that needs its own episode too, or maybe several. But the reality is, unfortunately, some scientists don't operate this way, especially if they've made a name off of a particular theory. I think I find this particularly frustrating with Robert Zimbardo. He was still defending his study against most of the criticisms in the 2000s. Scholars need to be willing to be wrong. They need to be willing to reevaluate their work as new evidence comes to light. He hasn't done that. There seems to be a narrative that to challenge someone's work is to attack them. But that's not how science is supposed to work. While people hang on those narratives that to challenge my work is an insult to me, they will be defensive and unwilling to re-examine things, and the science will suffer. Zimbardo testified at the sentencing of one of the Abu Ghraib guards. For anyone unfamiliar, Abu Ghraib was a prison in Iraq where several guards abused and brutalised detainees. Photos emerged of the abuse, and they're pretty horrific. I don't think I need to go into any detail here. The guards were tried and imprisoned for their actions. At the sentencing, Zimbardo made the case that being put in the position of a prison guard can lead normal people to do terrible things. However, many of the Abu Ghraib guards had long histories of misconduct that cast some doubt on this, as does the findings of the BBC prison study, among other investigations of compliance. Abuse is not inevitable if people are placed in these situations. Of course, nothing is ever simple, and while there is no evidence that the Abu Ghraib perpetrators were just following orders or victims of their situation, there is also a social context. I was in the US in 2003, and people there were understandably still very angry after the September 11 attacks. I did get a strong vibe that the general consensus was that whatever happened to anyone suspected of terrorism was justified. This probably put the guards in an environment where they could justify their behaviour to themselves. Not that this makes it okay. There were lots of soldiers who served under similar conditions who didn't commit war crimes. So, yes, social context matters, expectations matter, orders matter, but individual behaviour and choices also matter. There is a research paper abstract by Mastroianni, I hope I got that close to right, that sums it up pretty well, so I'm just going to quote it. To quote, "Two divergent narratives explaining these events emerged. A bad apple narrative and a bad barrel narrative. Neither does justice to the complex interplay of policy, organisational and individual factors that contributed to these tragic events. A perfect storm of poor leadership, chaotic and confusing policy changes, and a small group of corrupt and immoral soldiers produced this fiasco with global consequences." End quote. There is also a quote from the paper I find particularly telling. It refers to a documentary about Abu Ghraib, which included footage from the Milgram experiments of people continuing to deliver shocks as the learner appeared to cry out in pain. To quote, "This is an especially unconvincing implied parallel, given the halting, reluctant, conflicted responses of many of Milgram's research subjects, as compared to the laughing, leering, boisterous abuses at Abu Ghraib." End quote. This definitely shows me there is more to it than just the situation people were placed in. We do know people can do awful things. There have been several genocides since the Holocaust, since these studies were done. I don't have time to go into the research here in detail. Maybe that can also be a future, rather depressing episode. But atrocities are associated with dehumanising people, the self-interests of the perpetrators, and their belief about the appropriateness of their actions, much more than blind conformity or acceptance of roles, much more than just following orders. These studies do show us that some people conform, and even will hurt each other willingly or because they've been convinced to do so. However, there is also evidence of rebellion in these studies of conformity. In addition, we have seen that people having empathy for the learners in the Milgram experiment and being told to treat prisoners as individuals made participants less likely to treat others badly. So I think we need more empathy. I don't know how to go about that exactly, but maybe some of the studies I talked about in episode 1 are part of it. Stories can help people build connections, and maybe that in turn can help us build empathy. I don't know, maybe that's wishful thinking. But after an episode that got grimmer than I planned, I wanted a positive note to end on. So that's near where I'll wind up today. However, one last thing is that we saw in this episode the depth added to these narratives by people who went back to the study archives and looked at them with fresh eyes. Keeping records is important. Archives are key to how we understand the world and the past, and how we can examine the narratives of the past and see if they stand up to scrutiny. I'm going to talk more about this next episode with special guest Thomas O'Mahony from Beneath the Skin, Lions Led by Donkeys, and producer of the newest addition to my favourite podcast list, This Guy Sucked. All worth checking out while you're waiting for my next episode to come out, of course. As with the last episode, my sources are on my website, which now has a proper, if slightly long domain, ourstoriesandourselves.com. If you have thoughts, drop me an email at ourstoriesandourselves@gmail.com. Didn't go for the full domain email. Or on Blue Sky at ourstories.bluesky.social. Please feed the algorithm with likes, reviews and subscriptions, or just tell your friends. And finally, thanks to Podcats, Oliver Twist and Nancy. Shout out to Pete for the term Podcats. Finally, a closing quote from Oscar Wilde. Disobedience, in the eyes of anyone who has read history, is man's original virtue. It is through disobedience that progress has been made, through disobedience and through rebellion.